Tamara Brummer, Senior Advisor for Engagement and Outreach at Demand Justice.
Good morning, everyone. It's so good to see your shiny faces. It's very bright up here, but your faces are even brighter, so that's amazing. So we are joined by a dynamic group of women who are strategists and thinkers and movers and shakers in our city and in our country. And before we get started, I want to give a bit of context about the conversation we're going to have today. So in the matter of 6 years, the Supreme Court went from reaffirming the constitutional right to an abortion to abandoning the 50-year precedent of Roe v. Wade. The only thing that changed in that short time is the justices who made up the court. Now, as we reckon with a post-Roe world and seek to rebuild, protect, and expand the fundamental right to bodily autonomy, we must also confront the dangerous Supreme Court majority and the obstacles it will place in the way of those efforts. At this moment, we must think boldly about expanding the court in order to ensure that our work towards reproductive justice will not be stymied, and in order to protect our fundamental rights from further erosion. So I want to introduce our dynamic panel this morning. So we have Karen Finney, who is an independent consultant working with political and corporate clients in the United States and globally on public affairs, media, crisis communications, polling, branding, and strategy. A CNN political commentator, she was a senior advisor to Georgia gubernatorial candidate and soon-to-be governor, Stacey Abrams, the Democratic National Committee and AL Media in the 2018 election cycle. Finney served as senior advisor for communications and political outreach and senior spokesperson for Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign of 2016. Her experience includes work on 5 presidential campaigns, the Clinton administration, and she was the Democratic National Committee's first African-American spokeswoman. Thank you for being here, Karen. Next, we have Alencia Johnson, who is the Chief Impact Officer and founder of 1063 West Broad, a social impact agency specializing in the intersection of culture, impact, and purpose. She was a senior advisor to President Joe Biden's campaign, and earlier in the 2020 presidential cycle, served as the national director of public engagement for Elizabeth Warren's campaign. Prior to that, she spent 6 years as Planned Parenthood Federation of America, where she engaged political, media, entertainment, and corporate organizations and influencers to shift mainstream culture, and was the architect behind the dynamic Planned Parenthood Stand with Black Women branding. Thank you, Alencia, for being here. And last but absolutely not least, we have Maya Rupert, is a political strategist, writer, and distinguished fellow with Community Change. In 2021, she managed Maya Wiley's New York City mayoral campaign. She was robbed. In 2020, she served as campaign manager for Julian Castro's presidential campaign and is only the 3rd Black woman to have managed a major presidential campaign. When Secretary Castro exited the race, she joined Elizabeth Warren's campaign as a senior advisor. Maya is a nationally respected voice on progressive politics and the future of the Democratic Party. She has appeared as a guest on national television and radio, including for MSNBC, CNN, NPR, and Sirius XM. Let's give a round for all of our panelists this morning. So we're just going to jump in. I think we have I'm excited about this conversation. You all are very smart. I'm just honored to be here in your presence. I know that we have a lot to learn from you all. So Alencia, I'm going to start off with you. I think it would be really helpful if you could give us a bit, a snapshot of the current landscape of abortion laws in the states and how in the 3 months since Dobbs, what will come next. But I also think it'd be really important for us to be grounded in the history of how we even gotten here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so thank you for that question, and so glad to be here and having this conversation. I like to talk about the history of how we got here, especially I am from Virginia. My daddy is a pastor. I love me some Jesus. And because of that, I actually do the work that I do. And it makes me incredibly upset that this conversation has taken this horrific turn around religion, when the reality is the extreme religious right, their crusade was around segregation. It actually wasn't around abortion. And it wasn't until a few years after Roe v. Wade became law of the land in 1973 by justices appointed by Nixon as well. It was a few years later when President Jimmy Carter was running for re-election that they said, you know what, we're losing on the segregation thing. Well, let's stop being racist and let's go over here and do something about this, around abortion, and make it a wedge issue. And I like to I like to start with that to take out the steam and this culture that they're creating around religion and abortion rights, because the reality is there's a lot of support for abortion rights from people of various faith and denominations, particularly Baptists as well. And then after that, for nearly 50 years, they spent the extreme right, the religious right, spent a lot of time and money and resources changing the makeup of what we're talking about, the courts. And they were very clear that, you know what, if we're going to lose at the federal level and national level right now, let's focus on the state policies. Let's focus on shifting also at the same time, we're communications folks. Let's shift this narrative and let's get people to vote on this one issue and be so laser focused on that we will continue to lose in the short term to win in the long term. And that is how we got to this place right now where these folks who, claim that they're voting based on their faith and religion can elect someone like Donald Trump, because it wasn't about Donald Trump. It was about changing the makeup of the Supreme Court. And if one thing you can learn from that movement is that they were laser focused on getting to this point. And they got here, which is the crazy thing, and we've seen in the polling, they've gotten here and Republicans aren't even in support of this decision, right? And it's not a winning decision. I know we're going to talk about a lot of things that are happening, the current climate of abortion rights, but that work set us up for, during the Obama years, one of the most pro-choice the presidents that we've had. Under President Obama, there were over 200, almost like 250 state restrictions introduced, anti-abortion state restrictions introduced across the country, under President Obama. And that is because they have changed the makeup of these state legislatures. They have gerrymandered a lot of these districts so that there's this minority rule that is taking this playbook, literally copying and pasting these laws and policies within each state so that they could, some of these anti-abortion laws did pass, some did not. But now with Roe v. Wade having been overturned, we talk about trigger bans all the time. That happened, and immediately there were states where you could not provide abortion care. 30 days, 60 days, and now we're in a place where, folks are traveling to other states. We know this, that folks are traveling to other states, and yet those states have to figure out, like in California, they're trying to write into their constitution to protect access to abortion because they know the influx that they are going to get. And so I don't want to take up too much time because I know we've been talking about this. You see all the numbers on television, but it's good to be grounded in how we got here, because then we can take a little steam out of that fight, as well as understand that we might be losing in the short term, but we've got to stay focused in order to get to this long term of rebuilding abortion access in this country.
So I'll weigh in. One, that was an old bio. So one thing, I've been on the board of NARAL Pro-Choice America for 10 years, vice chair of the board. And I'm also on the board of End Citizens United, Let America Vote, who I think you're going to hear from later today. And I wanted to mention those two because, the other thing about this, and I think particularly for Black Americans and for Black women, what's happening in the court, there's an intersectionality to it. And I would argue that it's not just about reproductive freedom. It's about power. Republicans created abortion as a wedge issue to hold on to power. They thought this was going to be a big win for them, by the way, when the Dobbs decision happened. I don't think they recognized that 8 in 10 Americans support Roe v. Wade. I'm looking at Bob Kramer shaking his head in the back, who's a dear organizer, a friend from this world. And that doesn't mean that everybody calls themselves pro-choice. It means people might say, well, it's not for me, but I'm not going to tell my neighbor what to do. And I sure as hell don't think a politician should be I don't want Lindsey Graham telling me what to do. That's for damn sure. But I wanted to mention it also because, for those of us in these movements, the first indication that something was awry with the court, frankly, was the first voting rights decision, right? Because that's when we got the gutting of voting rights. You can clap. The gutting of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, I think for a lot of folks, was an alarm bell going off. That, and the court, let's be honest, it's got a mixed history, right? that we have some horrible decisions, and then it sort of turned itself around, and we had a lot of really important civil rights decisions. We were also to codify some of those decisions into federal law. And that's the other piece of this, right? Our government was designed to be a balance between these three parts. And again, I think that, with the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, that was the first indication that this branch was getting out of whack, right? And that was a real threat to democracy. And I think that's the other point. Obviously, the Attorney General made this point, and I think we need to see this in the bigger frame. And certainly, the Dobbs decision in overturning Roe v. Wade and the reproductive rights movement, I'll just be honest, I've been saying since last year, it's gone. Like, get ready, it's gone, stop pretending. People have been kidding themselves. And frankly, Democrats, and Brian and I used to talk about this early on, didn't want to believe it, right? So it's like, the Supreme Court, yeah, the courts, but we're fine. Not realizing, no, we're not, because while we were thinking we're fine, they weren't just focusing their strategy on the Supreme Court, but all the other levels of justice, right, in the courts. And so I do think the Dobbs decision was a shock to people who hadn't really recognized that this actually started a while ago. And it was enough of a shock to the system, not only around reproductive freedom, but around the courts and around the ways in which, and I think we saw this a lot last summer when we were having the conversation about the filibuster and the need for filibuster reform, because we've got the conservative movement perverting the levers of government to sway it to their ideological agenda, not for justice, not to deliver for the people, not to deliver for the things that a majority of Americans voted for and have said they support. So I think we just also need to see from the reproductive freedom movement, I feel like we were sort of, maybe we have to sacrifice, women have to sacrifice our right to control our bodies for just a minute, because we're going to have to win on this one at some point. We're going to have to win those Senate seats so we can codify it in law, to get people to wake up, to realize that we have to pay attention to the Supreme Court. We have to pay attention to what's happening in the lower courts. And I was just reading something from the Brennan Center this morning. One of the cases they're going to take up next week, I believe, could further completely gut the Voting Rights Act. So, and again, I think we have to approach all of these conversations with the understanding it's already gone. I mean, look who's on the court. I don't, maybe they'll try to come up with some half measure, but we should take the position that it's already gone. And if that's not a rationale for reform and expansion, when you have a court that is so perverted in terms of being out of alignment with where the country is, where the majority of the population is, and with the way the majority of the people, or at least the last few, got on the court, I don't know what is.
Besides Ketanji, of course.
Except Ketanji.
Ketanji High.
But I mean, it's not the last three, the two of the last,
right.
Put it that way. And last thing I'll say, though, quickly about Ketanji, we're going to have to really lift her up and support her, because I'll tell you what tends to happen. We get one in, right? We saw this with Vice President Harris. We get one in, and everybody's like, well, how come she didn't fix everything? And it's like, well, because she's one person, and she's the vice president. That's not the rule.
She didn't break it.
Right. And she's trying. Ketanji, I think, is going to do a lot for the court, but she is surrounded by a number of people who have a very different agenda.
Thank you. I want to dig in a little bit more about this. Karen, you're saying that we're going to pass really good legislation. Like, we're going to pass the Women's Health Protection Act, right? We're going to get the folks in the Congress. We're going to pass that. We're going to codify Roe. But our threat is the Supreme Court. Right? We're seeing that with voting rights. We're seeing that with environmental justice. We're seeing that with gun violence prevention. Like, the list goes on and on. It'd be really good to hear from you all. Like, why is court expansion in particular a really critical tactic in this long-term strategy that we're doing to protect and defend our democracy and our bodily autonomy?
Sure, I'm happy to start with this. And I mean, I think because, look, we can pass legislation, we can do a lot of stuff, but if it still has to go before the Supreme Court, and we still have an illegitimate Supreme Court that is going to get to the outcome that they want to, regardless of the law, that is a terrifying reality for our democracy. If let's assume we can all somehow get the ability to vote, which is already being gutted, right? Then we actually get the leaders that we need that reflect the values that we have, and they pass legislation that we want. If someone sues and that goes in front of the Supreme Court, this court has shown that its allegiance is not to actually interpreting what is in front of them. And I think that's a really important point to keep in mind when we're talking about the legitimacy of the court, because one of the tough things I think about this conversation is that among justice-minded people, there is this sort of sense of, we don't want to politicize the court, right? There's that desire that exists for people that there should be this, this part of the political system that is apolitical, right? That's never been true, but that sort of mythology is, I think, in enough of us that there's discomfort when we talk about institutional changes to the Supreme Court. But if you think about the Senate confirmation hearings that we watched, where people swore that they recognized Roe versus Wade as precedent and were going to interpret it as such. And then the first case that came in, there was no, okay, well, I heard this case and maybe I changed my mind. There's no argument that it was anything but an inappropriate use of the Senate confirmation process at best and flat out lying at worst. And if that's the system, we're not protecting a legitimate system. What we're talking about is restoring a legitimate system. If they are actually able to get lifetime appointments and be that dishonest about the jurisprudence that they are then going to turn around and apply, we don't have a legitimate system that we are trying to protect by saying we can't have institutional reform, saying that we can't talk about term limits, or saying that we can't talk about expanding the court, right? Like, we don't have that system anymore. And I think we have to be honest about that, because that's the tough part. If there's voting, there are so many things that individuals can do. And I never want to downplay the importance of a lot of that, but it's all got to come along with us being realistic about the role that the Supreme Court will continue to play. And we need a legitimate court.
And I'll just add to that about how illegitimate this court is. I mean, one of the justices' wife was part of the insurrection, right? Like let's be honest about that. And then that same justice said the quiet part out loud of like, oh, now we're going to come for same-sex marriage and contraception. And he didn't say interracial marriage because that benefits him. Yeah. But the reality is this court is so illegitimate. But at the same time, there's so many more people talking about the Supreme Court as a collective people that it does give me hope, especially when I think sometimes we have these conversations about the Supreme Court, about policies, and we forget that, to be honest, in a lot of places, our education system is failing a lot of people. So a lot of people don't connect the dots of the Supreme Court, right? Understanding, oh, I elect people that appoint these people. And to that point, we were talking about the other week, Donald Trump in 4 years changed the makeup of the federal courts by what, 30%? He appointed 30% of the federal judges, 200 plus. That is scary. And while we're talking about the Supreme Court, when we're talking about abortion access, it all actually happens before then, right? Like there are some circuit courts, right, where some of these decisions or these conversations start happening. And you just don't know which one you're going to get and who's going to say, actually, we're going to take this all the way up to the Supreme Court. And so I'm also really concerned about, we're going to elect some senators that will, of course, push through, get rid of the filibuster, Mandela Barnes and John Fetterman. We're going to do that, and we're going to codify Roe. I believe we can do that. However, it can be challenged back to this point, and then we're back at square one. And so I think we are in a moment of, and I know we're talking about abortion access and Roe, we're in a moment where we can really do some education in our communities about the rights that we all care about and how they are connected to this court, and connecting people's frustration with this court and connecting that to their ability to show up. And yes, it's going to be hard to navigate these voting laws and show up and stand in line and take off work, which is crazy. I mean, that's a whole nother conversation. But between voting rights, immigration, gun control, reproductive rights, the list goes on and on and on. There is an issue that all of us can be organizing around, and yet it all goes back to freedom, voting rights. And then if we talk about abortion care, and we talk about this, that was just the floor, right? Like, there's so many other things that are connected to our individual freedom and our bodily autonomy and our agency. And we have to do a really good job of connecting those and connecting that to what's happening at the Supreme Court. And listen, people thought the filibuster was crazy, that we didn't, that people weren't going to be on board with getting rid of the filibuster. But we realized, and I think even President Biden, look, obviously I worked for him. I've been frustrated because he doesn't like to say the word abortion. And I'm like, that's, not helping this culture right now. But even President Biden is governing differently than he was as a senator years ago because the people have pushed him, right? And there's support for filibuster, there's support for getting rid of the filibuster, there's support for Supreme Court reform, and that lies in us and the people.
I think that's such an important point in this issue about why expanding the court. It's not just that we just want judges in there who agree with us, right? That's not, but for John Roberts to say, well, Black people are voting in such big numbers. We don't have to
a Black president.
It's okay. And we had a Black president. What? We don't need pre-clearance anymore. What? Go stand in line for 8 hours in the sun without water and tell me if it's working, right? And similarly, Alito was, he didn't say it this way, but this is how it sure felt like, well, just let ladies vote on it. Because ladies are voting in bigger numbers back in the states. So we'll send it back to the states and just let them vote on it. Right? And knowing that Black and brown women who are most disproportionately impacted by the overturning of Roe v. Wade, it's harder for us to vote. We would love to vote on it. We would love for it to be easier for us to vote on it. And so it's also a matter of the nature of the decisions and the fact that in the Alito decision, you could see some of the arguments literally cut and pasted practically from what some of the ideologues who were arguing in the court had said. And so I think it's important that we acknowledge that it's not just that we want to expand just for the sake of expansion. It's that we want a court that I would love to see more people who actually know what bodily autonomy means and probably don't have to be. I mean, does Samuel Alito really understand that concept? No, I don't think so. Right? I mean, we need more people who understand the world as it is right now, as well as I think we need a court that if you're going to overturn Roe v. Wade, then give me a legitimate legal argument. Don't just put talking points in there from the right wing. I think that's the other part of it. And that's what undermines the legitimacy of the court. But I also, the second thing I would just say is, it's also why it's so important that this movement continue to build and that people see the strength and the power, not just on the right, but on the left and in the middle of this as an issue, as a voting issue, as a mobilizing issue, because we, the people, are ahead of where our elected leaders are right now. And we can't be afraid. We, in the same way we pushed a lot of leaders, including Joe Biden, just what Alencia just said, to recognize the need to change when it comes to the filibuster. The answer can't just be this is how it's been done or this is a tradition. Those are also code, right? We've got to say, no, we deserve better. That's why we're doing this.
Thank y'all for that. I think that what I'm also hearing is that we're at a moment where our organizations might need to catch up with what the people want and what the people need and what our courts need. And so to date, for instance, some groups on the front line of defending abortion access, like All Above All and We Testify, have supported the Judiciary Act. But others are still weighing the idea. I would really, really love to hear from you all about where do you think support stands on the Judiciary Act within the reproductive justice movement, and what will it take for that support to grow?
Well, how much time do we have?
6 minutes.
Since I've worked at one of these places. I'm glad you mentioned All Above All because they are doing amazing work. It's their advocacy got repealing the Hyde Amendment in the Democratic Party platform in 2016, which was extremely powerful, extremely powerful. Within the broader reproductive freedom movement, there are, within every movement, there are some who are, I would say, further along, because I don't want to say more progressive than others, because I don't like to make progressive feel like an icky term. I think that we are all in this for progress and freedom. Reproductive justice leaders, specifically, the framework that was coined in 1994 by majority Black women, and including LGBTQIA folks, as well as other people of color, is a framework that really sits in bodily autonomy and agency and justice. And it talks about the right to parent and how to parent and whether to parent in safe communities. It's a very intersectional framework. Those leaders, as any Black leader, Black and brown leader, didn't have a lot of resources and still don't have a lot of resources. But you know what? They are the closest to the pain and saw this, what is happening today, 20 years ago, 20, 30 years ago, right? Those leaders, I believe, are on board with all of this because of how connected all of our rights are to bodily autonomy. I think when it comes to some of the larger institutions that, whether it's around advocating for reproductive rights or providing reproductive health care, there are real considerations for them, depending on, what states they're operating in and legal battles, all of these considerations, and the fact that there are so many different restrictions for how, physicians can or cannot perform care. I mean, literally, we have physicians calling lawyers saying, can I help this dying mother? Can I actually provide this medical procedure, right? Like I had a friend of mine, she's an OBGYN, Black woman, I don't want to talk about her organization affiliation, but very prominent in the reproductive rights movement. She was saying, even in medical schools, they're not teaching abortion care, this medical procedure, right? So all of this is happening, and there are these organizations who have very real considerations. I think fundamentally, we're moving to a place much like ending the filibuster. A lot of these organizations weren't on board with ending the filibuster, but we have no more tools left, right? Like, we have to go as far as we can. And where we will move these bigger organizations is through the people, to be honest, through the people that we serve, through the people who are supporting these organizations, institutions. And the other thing I want to talk about too, really quickly, limiting access to abortion care does not do anything for the maternal mortality crisis that we have in the United States. And we know those statistics around Black women particularly. I mean, if Beyonce and Serena Williams were almost dying in childbirth, what does that mean for Black women who don't have any of those resources or that access, right? And I was reading this stat earlier today about how between January 2000 and May 2022, 52 countries have changed their abortion laws. Majority of those countries have expanded abortion laws because of maternal and infant mortality rates. 3 countries have backtracked: Nicaragua, Poland, and the United States. And the richest nation in the world, with the most resources, very intelligent people, we have backtracked on an issue that folks say that they care about. And so we have to understand all of these things when we are having these conversations. And I think the way that we are going to get majority of the movement on board with Supreme Court reform and expansion will be listening to those closest to the pain. And that's the reproductive justice leaders who are organizing with pennies in this movement, but are so close to the pain and understand that this has to happen in order for us to have better outcomes for our future.
I mean, I think, yeah, definitely. I agree completely. I mean, I can say, what I've seen is a couple of things. Just to add on to that, the recognition of the intersectionality of these issues. And, I just want to say, for the reproductive justice groups, most of them who are in the South, they've pretty much been living this reality for the last 20 years because of all of the various measures, between trying to fight those measures off and make sure that women actually had access, they've been living the nightmare. We're just catching up, frankly, in a lot of ways, and more people are being impacted by it. But, I agree. I think it has to come from the membership of these organizations, from, the folks that we're trying to persuade, to be more supportive of our issues, because that is really how we moved on. I'll say with NARAL filibuster, a lot of it was last summer really joining in coalition with Black women's organizations like the Black Women's Roundtable, who every week for a couple of months was at the Supreme Court, talking about our voting rights and the connection between our voting rights and our reproductive freedom as Black women. And so that really helped to move the conversation to a different place. And so I do think seeing it more, two things. As I said, this is about protecting democracy and the legitimacy of our democracy. Think about this. We live in a country where Black women, it's harder for us to vote. And we now have fewer rights. We have less control of our bodies. And that is not just a step back to the 50s or 40s. That is back to slavery. That's the last time we didn't have control of our bodies. In America, we need to shock people into what taking away these rights really means for the legitimacy of our democracy, in addition to these issues. And then the second thing, I do think it is a matter of the more we work in coalition, which I like to say, we have to, because our opposition is working in coalition. The Proud Boys are working with, the Christian right. And there's nothing particularly, in my faith journey, we're not about the Proud Boys, don't represent us. But my point is, I think we also have to, the more we are working in coalition, the more we are recognizing the connection of our rights, the connection of our freedom, and the connection to the court, and the importance of the legitimacy of the court.
And I think I'll just add, I think in a way, how outrageous this decision is makes this an easier process for a number of the institutions that maybe felt a little discomfort with the idea of starting to talk about court reform. I think that it makes it clear this is not a political thing. We're not all here because we disagreed with a ruling from the Supreme Court. I think when you think about some of the bigger institutions, especially the legal organizations that maybe were more reticent to say, filibuster reform, court reform, they're the ones that are also going to look at this. And I don't know the law professor who can teach Roe to Casey to whole women's health to Dobbs and have that be this is an evolution of a law conversation, right? So I think in a way, opponents overplaying their hand make it easier to support some of these measures, because it makes it clear we're not talking about a political difference. We're not, upset because it's scary to lose the court for a generation because your movement is out of step with the direction of the country. It's terrifying to lose it despite the fact that you're not, but because it was stolen, right? So, I think that this really does crystallize the point.
Thank you for that, y'all. We have a couple more minutes, and I just want to kind of bring it all together. Brian talked about this at the top, and you all mentioned this as well, is that we know that new polling is showing us that more than 70% of Democrats, 63% of Black voters, and 60% of women support court expansion. I think because of all the things you all have laid out, the folks closest to the ground, the closest to the issue. When I talk to people about our work that we do, everyday people can make a connection this is connected to this. This court did this, so then we should change the court. Obviously, when people look at their lives, what is it going to take for our leaders, our elected leaders, who are the checks and the balance to this out of control court, to get on the same page as their constituents on this issue?
I think I think I said this before, they've got to hear from the people. They've got to hear from us that this matters. They've got to hear from us that we won't vote for you if you don't support this, right? That we see this as a way to, affect change. Yes, we want healthcare, we want all these other things, but we want a Supreme Court because, as Alencia said, all of these things, we can pass a law, it can get challenged in, pick a state. Then that's what they do, right? With the intentionality of working its way up to the Supreme Court. So I think that's where it comes from. It has to come from us. And I think the second piece is, again, I think this democracy framework is one. It's in the conversations that I've had, they seem to feel a little more comfortable there. I'm sort of like, who cares if they say it's partisan? So what? Do it anyway. But I do think, because in all sincerity, it is a sign of our democracy in peril.
And I'll add to that too. It's the people. We will not vote for you. And then when they're in office, here's where we sometimes take a breath until the next election. We don't go in there and hold them accountable. And there are so many organizations who literally make it so easy. Dial this number, it's going to connect you with your senator or your member of Congress. But even more importantly, go talk to your governor, your city councilman, your state legislature. And then let's take it a little bit further. I was on a panel earlier talking about progressive values, and we were talking about we need more people closest to the pain running for office, right? And I know we're sitting in Washington, D.C., and we're consultants up here, but there's this consulting class that says, no, this is who you run, and this was who is going to win. And yet, they said that too about Ayanna Pressley. They said that about Cori Bush. They said that about Lauren Underwood. Of course, Black women, right? But these women are getting in office, and they're shaking things down and changing the makeup of at least our side, which hopefully if we keep doing this, we actually won't have scared people on the left that, expanding the Supreme Court won't be such a radical notion. The Judiciary Act won't be such a radical notion for us to all be a part of. So yeah, we've got to vote. We've got to hold people accountable, but we've also got to step in there and run for office and support someone. Might be your favorite member of Congress, and they're nice. I have lots of friends that I love that are in Congress,
friends.
And they would get a little upset when I decided to, support their opponent. To be honest, I got a lot of flack for working for Elizabeth Warren versus some other people in the 2020 presidential primary. But it's because I needed that bold leadership that didn't need to be told to go out here and fight for all of these issues. So I'm a little hyped up right now because we're getting ready for midterms. So.
And the last thing I would just add probably is I think we need to do all of this, and we also need to sort of organize informally in our own communities. I think we need to talk to more people because these aren't actually radical ideas when we don't present them as, one side thinks this, one side thinks this. I think that there are a lot of conversations that can be had among people who trust each other that can actually move people along in getting to, we're not talking about something radical. Court packing sounds terrifying, and that's what you're hearing about. That's not what we're saying. Here's what happened. I think that when you're talking to individuals one-on-one and you say, they just decided that Barack Obama was not going to get to nominate his final justice. That doesn't make sense to anybody. It's not until it gets put on a national stage and treated like there are two sides of this issue that people are on different sides. When you're saying that to someone, people's reaction is, well, yeah, that wasn't fair, right? And if we can have those conversations, then these politicians are hearing from even more people because that's what we need. We need people to understand that we're not talking about something unreasonable.
Yeah, I'll just add, I was working early on for a candidate who I won't name who is running for Senate. And early on in some of the focus groups we did, when you talk to people about, well, what was broken or what was wrong, and specifically around voting rights, unprompted, and these were, infrequent African-American and white low-income voters who said, well, the filibuster. And I was like, yes, tell us more, But, speaking of the consulting class, we're, watching this with a room full of consultants who had very different perspectives about the saliency of this issue. And even the candidate was like, oh, I got to rethink where I am. And, this person wanted to be for filibuster reform, had been told by the consultants, that's too radical, to your point. But then, again, to see it coming out of the mouths of people in that state who are, again, low propensity voters, it was a whole different ballgame. So I think this idea of also organizing and having these conversations in our communities is really important, because that's the other way it filters up.
Absolutely. Our communities know how the system works and how it doesn't work, right? And are looking for ways to change that. I want to thank you all so much, Alencia, Karen, and Maya, for joining us and giving us some of your jewels and your thoughts on this issue. Thanks, y'all.